Chapter 12, A Rescue. Lewis liked to sleep on the lake. At night, after blowing taps, he would waddle down to the sandy beach by the dock. There he removed his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet, and he hid them under a bush. Then he shoved off in the water. As soon as he was afloat, he would tuck his head under a wing. For a while, he would doze and think about home and his parents. Then he would think about Serena, how beautiful she was, and how much he loved her. Pretty soon, he would be fast asleep. When daylight came, he would swim ashore and eat a light breakfast of water plants. Then he'd put out his things, climb onto the flat rock, and blow reverie. The boys, hearing the trumpet, would wake and rush to the dock to swim before breakfast. Boys and girls, I want to play those songs for you. Maybe when I'm done with these 2 chapters, okay? Or maybe I'll attach them. I'll figure something out. To get a swim in before breakfast. After supper at night, the campers would often play volleyball. Lewis loved the game. He couldn't hop around as fast as the boys, but he could reach far out with his neck and poke the ball into the air and over the net. It was very hard to get the ball past Lewis. He could return almost any shot. When the boys chose sides at the start of the game, Lewis was always the first to be chosen. The boys loved camp life in Ontario. They learned how to handle a canoe. They learned to swim. Sam Beaver took them on nature walks and taught them to sit quietly on logs and observe wild creatures and birds. He showed them how to walk in the woods without making a lot of noise. Sam showed them where the kingfisher had his nest, in a hole in the bank by the stream. He showed them the partridge and her chicks. Boys and girls, do you remember when the mascot came to school and we asked him what kind of a bird he was, Slappy? And he said he was a kingfisher. Remember? Okay, anyways. He showed them the partridge and her chicks. When the boys heard a soft coo, 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 Sam told them that they were listening to the saw-whet owl, smallest of the owls, no bigger than a man's hand. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the whole camp would wake to the scream of a wildcat. Nobody ever saw a wildcat during the entire summer, but his scream was heard at night. That reminds me of the fox. One morning when Sam was playing tennis with Applegate Skinner, Sam heard a clanking noise. He looked behind him, and there, coming out of the woods, was a skunk. The skunk's head was stuck in a tin can. He couldn't see where he was going, and he kept bumping into trees and rocks. And the can went clank, clank, clank. "That skunk is in trouble," said Sam, laying down his racket. "He's been to the dump looking for food. He poked his head into an empty can, and now he can't get it out." The word spread quickly through the camp that a skunk had arrived. The boys came running to see the fun. Mr. Brickle warned them not to get too close. The skunk might squirt them with his perfume. So the boys danced around, keeping their distance and holding their noses. The big question was how to get the can off the skunk's head without getting squirted. "He's going to need some help," said Sam. "That skunk will starve to death if we don't get that can off." All the boys had suggestions. One boy said that they should make a bow and arrow, tie a string to the arrow, shoot the can with the arrow. Then, when it hit the can, they could pull the string and the can would come off of the skunk's head. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. It sounded like too much work. Maybe a little dangerous. Another boy suggested that 2 boys climb a tree. One boy could hang by his feet from the other boy's hands. When the skunk walked under the tree, the boy, who was hanging by his feet, would reach down and pull the can off. And if the skunk squirted, the perfume wouldn't hit the boy because he would be hanging in the air. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle didn't like it at all. He said it was extremely impractical, and furthermore, he wouldn't permit it. Another boy suggested that they get a block of wood, smear it with glue, and when the skunk knocked against it, the can would stick to the block of wood. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle said he didn't have any glue anyways. While everybody was making suggestions, Sam Beaver walked quietly to his tent. He returned in a few minutes with a long pole and a piece of fishing line. Sam tied one end of the fishing line to the pole. Then he tied a slip knot to the other end of the line and formed a noose. Then he climbed on the roof of the porch and asked the other boys not to get too close to the skunk. The skunk all this time was blundering around, blindly bumping into things. It was a pitiful sight. Sam, holding his pole, waited patiently on the roof. Boys and girls, you see those commas in that sentence? It wouldn't make sense if we just steamrolled through without those pauses. So we have to say, Sam, holding his pole, waited patiently on the roof. He looked like a fisherman waiting for a bite. When the skunk wandered close to the building, Sam reached over, dangled the noose in front of the skunk, slipped the noose around the can, and gave it a jerk. The noose tightened and the can came off. As it did so, the skunk turned around and squirted right at Mr. Brickle, who jumped back, stumbled, and fell. All the boys danced around, holding their noses. The skunk ran off into the woods. Mr. Brickle got up, dusted himself off. The air smelled strong of skunk. Mr. Brickle smelled too. Boys and girls, have you ever been really close to a skunk spray? I don't mean like you're driving by and somebody else has hit the skunk with the car and it smells. I mean like up close. Honestly, it is such a strong smell that it almost could make you feel like you're going to throw up. It's intense. Yeah. Congratulations, Sam, said Mr. Brickle. You have aided a wild creature in giving Camp Kookooskoos a delicious dash of wild perfume. I'm sure we will all remember this malodorous event for a long time to come. I don't see how we can very well forget it. Boys and girls, we better look that word up. Malodorous. Malodorous. Cahow! Cried Lewis, lifting his trumpet. The lake echoed with the sound. The air was heavy with the rich, musky smell of skunk. The boys danced and danced, holding their noses. Boys and girls, think of that word danced. Think of it more like having ants in your pants than dancing. Some of them held their stomachs, pretending to throw up. Then Mr. Brickle announced that it was time for the morning swim. A swim will clear the air, he said, as he walked away toward the cottage to change his clothes. After lunch each day, the campers went to their tents for a rest period. Some of them read books. Some of them wrote letters home, telling their parents how bad the food was. Some just lay on their cots and talked. One afternoon, during rest period, the boys in Applegate's tent began teasing him about his name. Applegate Skinner, said one boy. Where did you get such a crazy name, Applegate? My parents gave it to me, replied Applegate. I know what his name is, said another boy. Sour Applegate. Sour Applegate Skinner. The boys howled at this and began chanting, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate. Quiet, bellowed the tent leader. I don't think it's funny, said Applegate. His name isn't Sour Applegate, whispered another boy. His name is Wormy Applegate. Wormy Applegate Skinner. This suggestion was greeted with screams of laughter. Quiet, bellowed the tent leader. I want quiet in this tent. Leave Applegate alone. Leave rotten Applegate alone, whispered another boy. And some of the other boys had to pull their pillows over their heads so their snickering couldn't be heard. Applegate was sore. When the rest period was over, he wandered down to the dock. He didn't like being made fun of. Of course not, right? And he wanted to do something to get even. Without saying anything to anybody, he slid a canoe into the water and paddled out in the lake, heading for the opposite shore a mile away. Nobody noticed him. Applegate had no business taking out a canoe alone. He had not passed his swimming test. He had not passed his canoe test. He was disobeying a camp rule. When he was a quarter of a mile from shore, in deep water, the wind grew stronger. The waves got higher. The canoe was hard to manage. Applegate got scared. Suddenly, a wave caught the canoe and spun it around. Applegate leaned hard on his paddle. His hand slipped and he lost his balance. The canoe tipped over. Applegate found himself in the water. His clothes felt terribly soggy and heavy. His shoes dragged him down. He could barely keep his head above water. Instead of hanging on to the canoe, he started swimming toward shore, which was a crazy thing to do. One wave hit him square in the face and he got a mouthful of water. "Help!" he screamed. "Help me! I'm drowning! I'll give the camp a bad name if I drown! Help! Help!" Counselors sprinted to the waterfront. They jumped into canoes and rowboats and started for the drowning boy. One counselor kicked his moccasins off, dove in, and began swimming towards Applegate. Mr. Brickle raced to the dock, climbed to the diving tower, and directed the rescue mission, shouting through the megaphone. "Hold on, hang on to the canoe, Applegate," he shouted. "Don't leave the canoe." But Applegate had already left the canoe. He was all alone, thrashing about and wasting his strength. He felt sure that he would soon go to the bottom and drown. He felt weak and scared. Water had gotten into his lungs. He couldn't last much longer. The first boat to get away from the dock was rowed by Sam Beaver, and Sam was pulling hard at the oars, straining every muscle, but things didn't look good for Applegate. The boats were still a long way from the boy. When the first cry of "help" was heard in the camp, Lewis was coming around the corner of the main lodge. He spied Applegate immediately and responded to the call. "I can't fly out there," thought Lewis, "because my flight feathers have been falling out lately. But I can certainly make better time than those boats." Dropping his slate and chalk pencil and his trumpet, Lewis splashed into the water and struck out, beating his wings and kicking his great webbed feet. A swan, even in the summer when he can't fly, can scoot across the water at a high speed. Lewis's powerful wings beat the air. His feet churned the waves as though they were running on top of the water. At a moment, he had passed all the boats. When he reached Applegate, he quickly dove, pointed his long neck between Applegate's legs, and then came to the surface with Applegate sitting right on his back. So he kind of got there, dove under, and then came up, and Applegate was on top of him. Cheers came from the people on the shore and the boats. Applegate clung to Lewis's neck. He had been saved in the nick of time. Another moment, and he would have gone to the bottom. Water would have filled his lungs, and he would have been a goner. "Thank God," shouted Mr. Brickle through the megaphone. "Great work, Lewis. Camp Kookooskoos will never forget this day. The reputation of the camp has been saved. Our record for safety is still untarnished." Lewis didn't pay much attention to all the shouting. He swam very carefully over to Sam's boat, and Sam pulled Applegate onto the boat and helped him to the stern seat. "You look pretty funny riding a swan," Sam said. "And you're lucky to be alive. You're not supposed to go out alone in a canoe." But Applegate was too scared and too wet to say anything. He just sat and stared straight ahead, spitting water out of his mouth and breathing hard. At supper that night, Mr. Brickle placed Lewis at his right in the place of honor. When the meal was over, he rose and made a speech. "We all saw what happened on the lake today. Applegate Skinner broke a camp rule, took out a canoe alone, and upset. He was drowning when Lewis the Swan rapidly outdistanced all other campers, reached his side, held him up, and saved his life. Let us all give Lewis a standing ovation." The boys and the counselors stood up. They cheered and clapped and beat on tin plates with spoons. Then they sat down. Lewis looked embarrassed. "And now, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle, "I hope the rescue has caused you to change your opinion of birds. The first day you were here at camp, you told us how you didn't care for birds. How do you feel now?" "I feel sick at my stomach," replied Applegate. "It makes you sick at your stomach to almost drown. My stomach still has a lot of lake water in it." "Yes, but what about birds?" asked Mr. Brickle. Applegate thought hard for a moment. "Well," he said, "I'm grateful to Lewis for saving my life, but I still don't like birds." "Really?" said Mr. Brickle. "That's quite remarkable. Even though a bird saved you from drowning, you don't care for birds? What have you got against birds?" "Nothing," replied Applegate. "I have nothing against them. I just don't care for them." "Okay," said Mr. Brickle. "I guess we'll just have to leave it at that. But the camp is proud of Lewis. He is our most distinguished counselor, a great trumpet player, a great bird, a powerful swimmer, and a fine friend. He deserves a medal. In fact, I intend to write a letter recommending that he be given the life-saving medal." Mr. Brickle did as he promised. He wrote a letter. A few days later, a man arrived from Washington with the life-saving medal. And while all the campers watched, he hung the medal around Lewis's neck, alongside the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil. It was a beautiful medal. Engraved on it were the words, "To Lewis the Swan, who, with outstanding courage and complete disregard for his own safety, saved the life of Applegate Skinner." Lewis took off his slate and wrote, "Thank you for this medal. It is a great honor." But he thought to himself, "I'm beginning to get overloaded with stuff around my neck. I've got a trumpet, I've got a slate, I've got a chalk pencil, now I've got a medal. I'm beginning to look like a hippie. I hope I'll still be able to fly when my flight feathers grow in again." That night, when darkness came, Lewis blew the most beautiful taps he had ever blown. The man who had brought the medal was listening and watching. He could hardly believe his ears and eyes. When he returned to the city, he told people what he had seen and heard. Lewis's fame was growing. His name was known. People all over were beginning to talk about the swan who could play the trumpet. Chapter 13, End of Summer. A trumpet has 3 little valves. They are for the fingers of the player. They look like this. By pushing them down in the right order, the player can produce all the notes of the musical scale. Lewis had often examined these little valves on his horn, but he had never been able to use them. He had 3 front toes on each foot, but being a water bird, he had webbed feet. The webbing prevented him from using his 3 toes independently. That means that he could like go like this, but he doesn't have the ability to just do one independently. Luckily, the valves on the trumpet are not needed for bugle calls, because bugle calls are a combination of do, mi, and sol. And a trumpet can play do, mi, sol without pressing down any valves. "If I could just work those 3 valves with my 3 toes," he said to himself, "I could play all sorts of music, not just bugle calls. I could play jazz, I could play country and western, I could play rock, I could play the great music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Sibelius, Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Brahms, everybody. I could really be a trumpet player, not just a camp bugler. I might even get a job with an orchestra." The thought filled him with ambition. Ambition means the desire to want to do something. Lewis loved music, and besides, he was already casting about for ways of making money after camp was over. Although he enjoyed life at Camp Kookooskoos, Lewis often thought of his home on Upper Red Rocks. Lewis often thought of his home on Upper Red Rock Lake in Montana. He thought about his parents, his brothers and sisters, and about Serena. He was terribly in love with Serena, and he often wondered what was happening to her. At night, he would look up at the stars and think of her. In the late evening, when the bullfrogs were calling tronk across the still lake, he would think of Serena. Sometimes he felt sad, lonely, and homesick. His music, however, was a comfort to him. He loved the sound of his own trumpet. Summer passed all too quickly. On the last day of camp, Mr. Brickle called his counselors together and paid them what he owed them. Lewis received $100, the first money he had ever earned. He had no wallet or no pockets, so Mr. Brickle placed the money in a waterproof bag that had a drawstring. He hung this money bag around Lewis's neck, along with the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil, and the life-saving medal. Lewis went to Sam Beaver's tent and found Sam packing his things. Lewis wrote on his slate, took off his slate and pencil. "I need another job," he wrote. "Where should I go?" Sam sat down on the bed and thought for a while. Then he said, "Go to Boston." Oh, I just lost my spot. "Go to Boston. Maybe you can get a job with a Swan boat." Lewis had never been to Boston, and he had no idea what a swan boat was, but he nodded his head. Then, on his slate, he wrote, "Do me a favor?" "Sure," said Sam. "Take a razor blade and slit the web on my right foot so I can wiggle my toes." He held out his foot. "Why do you want to wiggle your toes?" asked Sam. "You'll see. I need my toes in my business." Sam hesitated. He borrowed a razor blade from one of the older counselors. He made a long, neat cut between Lois's inner toe and middle toe, then another one between Lewis's middle toe and outer toe. "Does it hurt?" Lewis shook his head. He lifted the trumpet, placed his toes on the valves, and played do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Go! Sam grinned. "The Swan boat will hire you, all right. You're a real trumpeter now. But with your web cut, swimming will be harder for you. You will have a tendency to swim in circles because your left foot will push harder than your right foot." "I can manage," wrote Lewis. "Thanks so much for the surgery." Next day, the campers left. The canoes had been hoisted onto racks in the boathouse. The float had been hauled onto the beach. The windows of the lodge had been boarded up against bears and squirrels. Mattresses had been packed into zipper bags. Everything was snug and ready for the long, silent winter. All of the campers, only Lewis stayed behind. His flight feathers were growing fast, but he still couldn't fly. He made up his mind that he would remain at camp all alone until he was able to take to the air again, and then he would fly straight to Boston. The lake was lonely without the boys, but Lewis didn't mind being alone. For the first 3 weeks, he took life easy. He grew his flight feathers, dreamed of Serena by day and by night, and practiced his trumpet. He had listened to music all summer. Several of the boys had radios and record players, and now he practiced the songs on his trumpet. Every day, he got better and better. One day, he composed a love song for Serena and wrote the words and music on his slate. "Oh, ever in the greening spring, by bank and bough retiring, for love shall I be sorrowing, and swans of my desiring." He was really thinking of Serena, but he left her name out of it and kept it impersonal. His plumage, that means his feathers, his plumage was beautiful now. And he felt great. On the 21st of September, he tried his wings. To his great relief, they lifted him. Lewis rose into the air. The trumpet banged against his slate. The slate knocked against the money bag. The life-saving medal clinked against the chalk pencil. But Lewis was airborne again. He climbed and headed for Boston. It was wonderful to be in the sky again. Flying is a lot harder than it was before I acquired all of these possessions, thought Lewis. The best way to travel, really, is to travel light. On the other hand, I have to keep these things. I've got to have the trumpet if I am to win Serena for my wife. I've got to carry this money bag to hold the money to pay for my father's debts. I've got to have the slate and the pencil so I can communicate with people. I ought to wear the medal because I really did save a life. And if I didn't wear it, people might think I'm ungrateful. On and on he flew towards Boston, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and which is famous for its baked beans, its codfish, its tea parties, its Cabots, its Lowells, its Saltonstalls, and its Swan boats.